start, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the co-chairs of the caucus. That's Representative Steve Stivers, Charlie Dent, Jackie Spear, and Rush Holt. It's their commitment and dedication to the caucus that we're able to host scientists from across the country and highlight the amazing cutting-edge research taking place. Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Walter Koroshetz. Dr. Koroshetz is the Deputy Director of the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke at the NIH. Now I'm going to call that NINDS. Before joining NINDS, Dr. Koroshetz served as a Vice Chair of the Neurology Service, I'm going to get this right, and I think I need new reading glasses, Neurology Service and Director of Stroke and Neurointensive Care Services at Massachusetts General Hospital. He was also a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and has led neurology resident training at Mass General Hospital since 1990. Dr. Koroshetz graduated from Georgetown University, received his medical degree from the University of Chicago. He trained in internal medicine at the University of Chicago and Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Koroshetz trained in neurology at Mass General Hospital, after which he did postdoc studies in cellular neuropsychology at Mass General in the Harvard Neurobiology Department. He joined the neurology staff first in the Huntington's disease unit and then in the stroke and neurointensive care services. Today, Dr. Koroshetz is here to discuss a very relevant topic, traumatic brain injury. It's hard to open up a paper these days without reading about TBI in football players or in veterans. In fact, just yesterday, the front page of the Washington Post had an article highlighting what the NFL is doing to keep their players healthy. Given the spotlight on this issue, we are very pleased Dr. Koroshetz could join us to discuss the science behind the headlines. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Koroshetz.
Great. Well, I want to thank the caucus. Thanks, Lynn and her team, for having me come here and talk about this. I think what is a really important topic. I'm going to probably introduce more questions and anxiety than I solve, but that's the way sometimes science goes. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we think we know and kind of emphasize a lot of the things we don't know as well. So let's just start with the topic. What do football players and vets have in common? So interesting topic there. And I think this slide kind of tells you what they have in common. So for history of the military, a lot of it has been protecting the head. So you can see all these different types of helmet designs throughout the ages. Here's the more modern one down at the bottom. But athletes have had the same issue, and that's protecting the head. And so they've developed headgear over time, but probably started a little bit too late. So the initial old headgear was, leather helmets for football. And now, we have these really kind of Star Wars-like helmets. Some people think that they may actually cause more damage than they prevent, because they almost have turned into weapons. But both the military and the athletes have suffered with brain injury as a major problem. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today. And a lot of the science is going to go back and forth between the athlete and the service member. Certainly we can do research in athletes. There are sometimes captive audiences in our colleges and schools. Much more difficult to do so in the service members. So a lot of what we understand has come from studies of athletes, although there's clearly going to be differences, and these have to be explored carefully. And we can talk a little bit about that, especially with regard to blast injury. And I just want to point out that God also gave us a helmet, and that's the skull. So it's not a coincidence that the brain is enclosed in this very hard encasing of bone, and it's really to protect the brain. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to get on the internet for some strange reason, but what I wanted to talk to you about and to show two videos, which if you get a chance are worth seeing, if you copy these down, or you could Google, I'll give you the names. Pete Scoble, S-C-O-B-E-L-L, was a service member, and he has a YouTube video, and he talks about, he was in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was exposed to multiple blast injuries. These injuries, quote unquote, are unknown to the soldier many times. They're in the area of a blast. There's a huge shock wave, which I'll show you, that occurs. And they may just, feel stunned, go about their business. They may be unconscious for a while, wake up, go about their business. But many of especially in the mid-2000s, many of the service members were exposed to multiple blast exposures. And these were bombs going off on the side of the road, underneath the road. And some of them had severe injuries. They went into the medical system. But many of them were not really thought to have had a serious injury. And in Pete's case, he didn't realize what was going on until he developed symptoms of confusion, memory loss. He talks about how he drove into a parking lot and had no idea why he was there or what day it was, and just sat there trying to figure this out. Developed lots of problems with his controlling his emotions, got into big fights with his wife over silly little things. His whole life was going down the tubes. He left the Navy, and as he was leaving the Navy, he talked to a friend of his and told him what his symptoms were, and his friend said, well, these are symptoms of chronic traumatic brain injury. And he then sought medical treatment and ended up at a place called NICO, the National Intrepid Center for Excellence, which is over at Walter Reed National Navy Medical Center. It was built by a private organization with aid of all the federal people, and it's to take care of service members who have suffered from these repetitive traumatic brain injuries and have chronic problems. And he went there. He says, they showed me the picture of my MRI. I understood what was wrong. I can see where the damage is. And then they helped me work on my symptoms without, really trying to get me back to a functional human being. And he was at our meeting yesterday. We had a meeting about traumatic brain injury yesterday, and Pete showed up. He told us about his experiences, and they're on this YouTube video. And he's made a great recovery. But it took years. So the point in terms of the science is there's something going on with repetitive exposures to blast that are sneaking under the radar screen, were recognized by the military, and now they have big programs in to screen people, to pull people out of combat when they have had an exposure to blast, evaluate them. But when Pete was there, people were just learning this, and it really didn't happen. So the military is now far in advance of what we do on the field. The second video, which is the one at the bottom, is a video from Pat LaFontaine. And he was an NHL hockey player for the Islanders in the 90s, and he was a really great hockey player. And I got to work with him about 15 years ago, just after he retired. And he retired because he had 9 concussions. And after each concussion, it took longer and longer to get better, to the point where after the last one, it took 6 months to get better. And he basically had to sit down and talk to his doctor about, what is my future? I've already made all my money. I'm already famous. And he decided eventually to retire. But that decision took him 9 concussions. And he had that discussion multiple times and decided to take the risk and go back to play. Again, he was at our meeting yesterday as well. He's doing great, but he's really passionate about trying to, educate athletes about these risks. So 2 videos that are basically talking about the same exact thing. One happened in Madison Square Garden with this hockey player was knocked against the boards. The other one happened in Iraq, Afghanistan. But really the problems, in terms of the way the soldiers or the athletes are experiencing them, are really quite similar. And these videos really give you a personal experience of what it's like to be in a daze, to be fatigued, to not be able to understand what's going on with your brain. And that's the kind of thing we're worried about here, not something that's visible. So these people walking around, they look completely normal. Okay. Now, what is the magnitude for the military? Well, you would say, well, it's gigantic. Since 2000, they've counted 273,000 traumatic brain injuries in the military. And 82.4% of these are what are classified as mild. And that's what we'll spend a lot of our time today about. And the mild, in the vernacular, is called concussion. So that's mild concussion. Let's think about that. The severes are these red lines. These are the ones where the brain is really damaged right from the beginning. They go right to the emergency room, or they go right to emergency care, get shipped to Landstuhl, have heroic measures taken. What they found out in the blast injuries is, as compared to civilian injuries, which the worst ones are car crashes, for instance, in civilians, the brain swelling usually comes on about 24, 48 hours after the injury. Now remember, the brain is inside the skull, so if it starts to swell, there's no place for it to go. What happens then is the pressure inside the skull starts to go up and up and up because there's no place for the swelling to go. And it actually reaches the point where it blocks blood flow because the pressure coming out of your heart is now less than the pressure in your head. So there's no blood to your brain and you will die. So in civilian life, people have made these heroic procedures where they take the skull off and let the brain swell out. The reason I mention it because in the military with blasts, it's a little different. Their swelling comes on very quickly, within hours. So what the military had to do was to do these procedures to take the skull off and let the brain expand actually in theater to save people's lives. And I saw some of the soldiers at Walter Reed who came there in the neurointensive care unit, and they lived because they had these life-saving procedures. But again, an example, it's similar, but it's a little different. Here the blast, the swelling comes on very quickly. The other point to make is that besides them all being mild, and there's a large number, only 20% of them occur in the deployed veterans and service members. So 80% of these are occurring what they call in garrison. And so that's a large number. You say, what's that about? Well, these people are 18 to 30 years old. People 18 to 30 years old doing this kind of activity have a high risk of having head injury, whether they're in the military or out of the military. And these are the regular injuries that we all are at risk for: driving accidents, falls, exercises, fights, all sorts of things like that. So most of the military injuries are actually not blast injuries. The blast injuries are we think are a little bit different, need to be explored more closely. Now, traumatic brain injury, we're going to be talking most about the mild concussion. So that doesn't rate in terms of the burden of disease in the world. Concussions don't usually kill you, but traumatic brain injury kills you. The severe traumatic brain injuries kill you. As a matter of fact, it's the leading cause of death in children and young adults, adolescents. And that's because they're generally otherwise healthy unless they get in a car accident, a motorbike accident, they fall, a baby gets hurt falling down, or television comes down off and hits the baby. So traumatic brain injury, we're going to talk about the mild stuff, but the real bad public health impact is on the severes. They're fewer, but they can be really quite bad. They can be lethal, they can cause long-term disability, and they're not just a problem in the United States, they're a problem all over the world. As a matter of fact, it's worse in the underdeveloped countries. And the reason is because in the undeveloped countries, people are not driving around with cars with airbags. They're driving around on these little motorbikes with no helmets. So the motorbike accidents are a huge public health concern for underdeveloped countries due to the head injury. And that's why it's such a problem around the world. But in the US, so if you talk about incidents, it's estimated in the mid-2000s that there were 1.5 million emergency visits for head injury. And most of these are going to be concussions, okay? And the number, because the concussion awareness, we think, has increased in the last couple of years, the number of emergency visits for concussion has doubled in the last 5 years. So there's more of awareness, there's more access to the medical system, and there's also a couple of other policy things that I'll talk about. But it's responsible for 50,000 deaths in the US, 235,000 hospitalizations. So these are the really severe ones, moderate to severe ones. And the ED visits of children and teens, as I mentioned, has doubled in the last 2 years. Now, if we think about it and look at the prevalence of this condition, it's estimated that 6.5 million people in the US have significant disabilities due to head injury. There's the numbers who have the lesser disabilities, which we'll spend most of the time talking about today, is really unknown. But these are where the big numbers are. The disabilities are not as great, but it is still a problem, and we'll talk about that. And then I mentioned the soldiers from deployment. So what is traumatic brain injury? Well, it's actually not so easy to define. Basically, what it comes down to is it's traumatic brain injury is an effect on the brain. So it says it has to be some alteration in brain function. The reason we say that is because the brain function is so sensitive to any kind of insult that for an insult to be important, that we think that there has to be some abnormality in brain function. And it's caused by some external force. Now, that external force can be a hit on the head, can be a fall, but it was found that most of the really severe injuries are actually not due to impact at all, but they're due to what you call shear stress, and I'll talk about what that is in a second. So that's injury to the brain without any impact against anything. Okay. This is what blast injury looks like. So here, you're not being hit by a brick, but what happens is an explosion, and there's this huge pressure wave which then moves out in time, and depending on where you are in relation to the blast, you're going to get this pressure wave which has a big positive and then a big negative component going right through your body. Now, in the past, these kind of waves would kill you fairly commonly. The body armor protects the lung, which is very sensitive to blast. The blast is most dangerous in the body where you have an interface between tissue and air. So the gut and the lung are very sensitive. So many of these would have killed people, but now because of the body armor, they live through it, but the brain sees effects that we would never have seen in living people before because they would have basically died from the injury. Now, this injury is not new to Iraq and Afghanistan. It's actually in the military literature going back as long as anyone has worked with explosives. But it came under different names. It was shell shock was the name that was most commonly used in World War II. But it's the same type of thing. It's an explosion. You can see it. You see it on TV all the time. The guy's dazed, and then kind of comes to and starts fighting again. So, but there has been disability due to this in the military for at least World War II, World War I demonstrated. Now, what happens is that when the brain is initially exposed, you usually see some abnormality in brain function very quickly. So the concussion, classic concussion, the person goes unconscious. So the brain actually stops working. But what we know now is, especially from the soldiers and from the athletes, that some of the brain dysfunction, you don't see it right away. Now, maybe if you were there at the moment and had the right testing device, you might see it right away. But that doesn't happen. And what happens instead is people go about their business, and then the next day they say, gee, I don't think I'm the same as I was the day before. And that's sometimes this delayed onset of the symptoms, and that's true. Now, so this is a little brief course in neuroscience for TBI. Okay, so the brain here is the master computer. So it's got all these connections, doing computing that no man-made computer can do. The computing power is just off the charts. But it is a computing machine, and there's all these connections and wiring, just like a regular computer, just much more complex. Now, if you look at the brain, and this is a cut brain this way, you can see these gray areas around the surface. That's what we call gray matter, really good. And this is the white matter in the middle, because it's white. They're real smart neuroscientists. But the point I want to make is the computing is going on in these gray folds. That's where all the connections are. That's where all the circuits are. What the white is, which is the most part of the brain, is the white stuff, is the wires that are connecting all these different regions. So you have these circuits, and we don't really understand them. We know like the visual circuits are back here, and executive function and emotion circuits are here and here. But there's a lot of things we don't know about the circuits, but we know actually even less about the wires and where they go. And we'll talk about why that's important. So here's an example. This is a really cool technique where you can actually make the brain cells in a mouse with specific gene introductions turn different colors. And it's an amazing thing. We call it the brainbow for obvious reasons. But what I wanted to show, and it's a little hard to see, is that these are the brain cells themselves. So they're like the central, building. And then you can see all these little things outside, and that's all these processes that the brain cells are sending out, and that's where the connections are being made. Millions and millions of connections. Here's another picture, and this is in the cortex in one of those folds, and here you can see they're lined up. What you can't see very well is there's different colored strings coming down from each of these Christmas balls. And those strings are the wires. Now, compared to your computer where you have wires made out of metal, these wires are like the most delicate things you could imagine. They're just thin, wispy strings of basically round up fat. So it's got the consistency of, a film of butter. So these are really delicate. And that's what makes up the white matter. Here you can see them at really high magnification. This is not actually in the brain. This is from a peripheral nerve where they're actually a little bigger and easier to see. But they basically, some of them are just thin wires. Some of them have insulation around them, which makes them a little bit stronger. And they go through the white matter, and then they go into the spinal cord here. And what happens when you have injury, and so let's just talk about injury without any impact to the head. This is just rotational injury. So you're here, you're driving your car, you hit something, your head goes back, and then it goes forward. That rotation, what happens to the brain when you do that? Well, the spinal cord is stuck in the spinal cord is stuck in the spine. That can't move. So the brain is heavier, so it's spinning on the top of the spinal cord, and it actually can move inside the head. But it's not just moving back and forth. If it moves back and forth, they actually do okay. That's how the woodpecker cannot hurt his head, because his head is just moving back and forth. But this rotational movement stretches these thin wires, and you get damage to the wires. And that, we think, is really what is at the basis of the really bad head injuries. So this is an example of the white matter in microscopic after a head injury, and all these little red dots are abnormal swellings in these axons. So that's what we think the damage is microscopic damage in all these wires is what shuts down the brain. And it takes time for this to repair. That time course is what's going to be responsible for you returning back to function. A lot of this stuff, though, we don't understand fully. There are some bigger injuries that are easier to see. So here's a bleeding around the surface of the brain, because the brain is in the skull, and there are veins that go from the brain to the skull. So when you shift and the brain moves, those veins tear, and you get bleeding on the surface of the brain. That can be deadly because of that pressure buildup. If the bleeding occurs inside the head, there's no place for it to go, the pressure builds up. Here's multiple foci of bleeding, a very swollen brain. Again, these are the kind of things that got to fatal injuries, because that's how they got to the tissue. These are some examples, again, of this is a brain scan. It really looks normal. The only thing funny about it is it's really big. I mean, it's just, there's no space left. This could be normal for like a 4-year-old, which doesn't have a lot of space, but for an adult, the problem why there's no space is because the brain is swollen out and it pushed all the space around it away. This is the area of white matter that connects to two parts of the brain with a little damage in there, and that's actually a common place for where you might get damage, because when you shift the brain, the areas that damage are the ones where the tensile strength changes. So you have a really strong top of the spine, and then it fans out, the wires fan out, and they're not as strong, so there's movement there. And then when it goes to the corpus callosum in the center and it fans out, there's movement there. And so you get these little shearing injuries in the white matter. And again, over the surface of the brain is another place where it goes in, the fibers go into the cortex, and the cortex is much softer than the fibers, so you get shearing there. And actually, the tensile strength of the brain, the whole brain itself, when you take it out, it's really like a strong gel. So it's not a hard substance like muscle, or it's definitely not like bone. It's more like jelly. So when you shake jelly, you can see what happens. The same thing happens to the brain. It's a little more, I'd say it's a little more tensile strength than Jell-O, but not a lot. The white matter is more, the surface is less. Sometimes you can see things on the scans, sometimes you can't. These are little dots. So with concussion, one of our big problems is this white matter damage we think is there, we can't see it on any standard type of scans. And that's been a big problem. So you have the veterans coming back, they're having problems. Were they exposed to blast? Well, yeah, there was some blast. Well, do I have head injury? I get a regular scan, I don't see anything. So what do you tell them? So Pat LaFontaine said when they showed me my scan and showed me what my problem was, I felt, oh, now I understand it. But for a lot of people, you can't get that. You know, they have a really fancy scanner there, and they can see some things that you otherwise can't see. Okay, so the problem of brain injury and concussion is not new. This is a paper from the 1950s, just going through the major problems of concussion. So in concussion, you pass out, you come to, and we'll talk about what happens in recovery, but for many people, this period of time where you can't remember, you can't concentrate, you have headache, and you have dizziness, it's called post-concussive syndrome. So some people have concussion, they get better quickly. Others have a post-concussive syndrome, and it lasts different periods of time. And then we're worried that there's people who have multiple concussions, and then they get something worse going on down the line. The post-concussion syndromes take longer to get rid of them, but there's also a potential further problem that we'll talk about at the end that's come up with regard to the NFL football players and previously with boxers. And then even in 1950, Dr. Denny Brown said, you know, it's real important to understand whether this concussion thing is the same as people who have blast explosion exposures. So nothing is new. This is all the same problems, new techniques, new people being involved. What I wanted to show this slide is this is a rat, and he's developed, you know, he's been hit on the head, and then they look at how his brain activates. So they stimulate a nerve, and they look at the brain and see how does the brain activate. And what you find is that at 0 time, 0 minutes, you can't activate the brain. It's flatline. So that's this period of unconsciousness. So the brain completely shuts down at the time of concussion. And then in 1 minute, you see a little bit of activity, 2 minutes, a little more. And at 10 minutes, it's not quite to where it was, but it's significantly better. So this is one example, a really kind of take-home example of how concussion shuts down the brain, all activity stops, and then slowly starts to come back. Now, if you look at people, you can't measure this in their brain, although you can do electrical studies and show that you get something similar. But what you can do is also follow symptoms. So this is a large study from the NCAA of athletes, football, hockey, people who've been exposed to contact sports, and they have a concussion. And what they're plotting here is how they improve over time. And these are days. So you can see they have baselines on these athletes because they were in studies. They could test them ahead of time, get their baseline, and then follow them after they had a concussion. So you see that their scores on the Glasgow symptoms score goes way up, and then it starts to come down day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's almost close to normal again. Here's cognitive testing. Again, they're way down. Over a couple of days, they come back, and at 7 days, they're normal. Here's their balance. Again, abnormal. Maybe it gets back a little bit faster. So this is a standard view of the typical concussion. And a couple of points to make is that if your cognition is bad and your balance is bad, what you don't want to be doing is playing football. So you got to get out of the game, or your next exposure is going to be worse, or you're going to get more exposure because you just can't. You're just not really right. You can't handle this. And that's what Pat LaFontaine talks about playing hockey, you know, after he's concussed. He's out there skating. He doesn't even know where he is. And he's still out there skating. And he's, you know, putting himself at big risk of a second concussion. Now, this is another group, the same group, again, looking at high school and college athletes. They have 18,000 athletes now that they followed over a couple of years. Of these 18,000, they have 570 with concussion. So you can do the math and see what the percentage is. But the interesting part of this study is they separated those. On the previous slide, everybody really got better by 7 days, but this is a bigger study. So here they have 57 people who don't get better by 7 days. 493 are the more typicals that get better before 7 days. And here's the group that is a slow recovery group. And you can see it here and here. And these are days, But this jumps out to 90 days. So at 7 days, there's still a big difference in this group. But they're coming back to normal after about 3 months. But they're still not quite normal. So this is the issue of the people who really, are putting themselves at risk. So you're in school, you got your SATs to take, and I got a game. You have one of these, you shouldn't be taking your SATs. You're not going to do well. I mean, you may not have done well anyway, but you're really not going to do well now. And these are things that really can ruin a kid's, at least for a year in school. And then if you have multiple of these, like Pat LaFontaine, each one took longer and longer, and he was out multiple months, not just 3 months, but 6 months for some of these. So these can have real impact on the kids. What we don't really understand is, what is different in these two groups. Is it the previous head injury that they had? Is it they have some kind of predisposition? Migraine headaches are very common with head injury. That seems to slow down recovery. So there's a lot of things we have to learn, which would help parents to know what to do with their kids, and kids to know, in terms of returning to sports. Now, just an example of the next issue we're going to talk about is the number of concussions or the number of head injuries. So now there are these monitors that you can put in helmets. So the National Institute of Child Health funded studies to study athletes that have these sensors in. So that it goes in the helmet and it measures linear acceleration and rotational acceleration with a hit. And they put these in college players, 3 different colleges. One is a really good football school and the other is an Ivy League. So you're going to be able to guess which one is which. So this is the number of head impacts during the season. And these numbers are just astronomical. So 20% of the players on this really good team had over 1,000 hits in a season. So this monitoring system really changes. And most of these guys didn't know, it's just part of the game. Most of these occur in practice, not in games. So the number of hits that these people are taking is enormous. And most of them are not associated with any clinical symptoms. So unless you had a device in, you wouldn't even know that what they were being exposed to. So that's really where we are right now with the science. Now, people have had to make decisions on what to do. So the Academy of Neurology basically put out these guidelines fairly recently, and these are fairly common mainstream now, that what they say is if you have an athlete who's playing a sport and they have a concussion, which is a change in neural function, behavior, not necessarily going unconscious, then that person should come out and not play again. And the reason is, as I showed before, is that they go back in, they're at higher risk for another concussion, or worse, they could get a neck injury because they just don't know how to protect themselves and they're not thinking straight. And then the question is, if you have multiple concussions, the point is that they recommend you don't go back to play unless you have no symptoms left after exercise. So good point. Exercise can bring out the symptoms of concussion. Before you return to play, you should exercise, no symptoms, then you can return to play. You get headache or you get fatigue when you're exercising, that's still concussion symptoms and you should stay out. The big question is, when should you stop playing? And that's, I think, what parents wonder. The kid has one concussion, they get a little nervous, he goes back, he has a second one, then they get real nervous, and the third one, it's like, I don't think you should go back and play anymore, and the kid starts fighting with them. What's the right thing to do? That's the question, and I think having baseline testing, having follow-up testing, and making sure that if that person does not come back to normal, they've suffered cognitively, the Academy is saying you should give it up, no more contact sport for you, because that's really putting your brain at risk. Okay. And 26 states have legislation now that says somebody has a concussion playing sports, they can't go back until they see a licensed health professional. So there has been a community response. Now, how do we do better? How do we understand what's gone in the brain so we can show a scan and say, look, you should not play, look what happened, or your brain looks good, you can go back and play. That's what we'd like to do, a red light, green light type thing. We are way far away from that. But thank God we have math and physics. And I want to talk to you about a little bit about math and physics now. Now, nobody leave the room until you're going to find out how much fun this is. Okay. So, this is a water molecule. And water molecules are moving, depending on the temperature, and the brain is pretty warm. They're moving all the time. back and forth, back and forth. Now, it turns out that the MRI scan, there's a technique where you can actually detect how much water moved in a very short period of time. It's called diffusion imaging. Diffusion is this pathway of water movement. There's now an imaging technique that can actually say how much water moved in a short period of time. Not only that, but the scan comes in multiple directions, so it can tell you which way the water moved. Did it move left or right? Now, if you're in a glass of water, you'll move. It's random. You'll basically move around the central part, and the movement will basically look like a sphere. But if you're in those fibers, if you're a water molecule in those fibers that I showed you, then you can't move left or right. You can only move along the fiber. And this technique can pick that up. That's called diffusion tensor imaging. So they can use the movement of water as a kind of like a caricature of what the fibers look like. So we want to look for damaged fibers. This might be a good technique. The next step is actually to see the fibers. So this is the next level, which is really not yet out there. It's just starting out in research now. The other technique I'll show you just to see how water moves, people have done that already in brain injury. This is actually now, for each of those little dots, I give an arrow for which way the water moved. That should be the arrow for the fiber. And so I can make a map of the different arrows that shows me where the fiber pathways look like. And that's what this does, is tracking a fiber by looking at the movement of the water molecules in a small space in the brain and putting it all together to track a fiber. Now, the NIH is funding a project now, which is like a Star Wars for brain scientists, where they're trying to use the MR to get the best pictures of these wires and how they connect. And these are actually what they're getting now. So they're getting amazing pictures of the wires in the brain using this technique, which is, the water diffusion and its direction of diffusion. So that's what's coming. And what we're going to be able to do soon is to say, oh, this fiber is gone. You had a head injury. You had a fiber here once before, and now it's gone. The evidence of real damage. Or it looks fine. All the fibers are intact. I think still we got some years to go, but this Connectome project has tremendous import for traumatic brain injury, we think, because it gets us to look at the white matter where we've never really been able to see much before. And lots of other diseases, too, are going to be impacted by this because there's connections of the brains we could never see before. So there's going to be a number of diseases that really are helped by this. But what we have now is some interesting stuff that needs to be confirmed, but these are studies looking at the water movement in soccer players. And they count the number of headers that a soccer player did, and then they find that with a control group, I think these were soccer players who don't head the ball. I guess I don't know soccer that much, but it's forwards and defense. Or somebody heads a lot. And that was the group, and then they have a control group that doesn't head much. And they can claim that they see changes in the water movement and fiber tracks in the back of the head, which is where you would think you would find it, given they're mostly heading with the back. Or you hit with the front, and then the brain hits the back of the skull. So that's kind of interesting. Now, in the military, the blast injury has been invisible. But with this technique, this study came out a couple of years ago in the New England Journal, they basically can see, compared to the control group, the TBI soldiers in Landstuhl, and they're imaging them in Germany before they come back to the US, they can see a difference in the water movement in certain brain areas. And so this is the best we can do right now. This is before being able to look at the actual tracks themselves, but I think this is coming. And then we get to the other issue, which is the longer-term effects of brain injury, and we're going to talk a little bit about what you've seen in the papers about National League football players, but it's not just football players. It's anybody with lots of head injuries, and maybe not the concussions like Pat LaFontaine, but 1,000 of these hits every year for 20 years. I mean, that's the thing we don't know. But here, these are NFL players who have loss of cognition. So they're off the normal track in terms of cognition, and they have depression. And they can see changes in the water movement in the white matter, again, see the white matter in the players who have depression compared to the controls who don't have this. So this is where we are right now. This technique is getting us something. And then we get to the last, and this is the worst case scenario, and was described in 1928, and people called it punch-drunk syndrome, so it was boxers. And they looked like they were drunk, but they're not drunk. Their brains were damaged by all the boxing, and they were found to have what we call dementia, and many of these people were in asylums, so that's how bad they were. They got to the point where they couldn't manage at home. Their brains were so damaged. And this happened 15 years after they retired from boxing. So this is a brain disease that comes on years after the injury is stopped. And unfortunately, this is an example from a boxer. And what happens in this disease is that area where the circuits are, so this is not the white matter now, we're talking about the circuits, that area of brain gets destroyed. And it gets filled with basically a protein that forms tangles and gets stuck in the nerve cells called tau. And they're called tau tangles. And they are seen in this disease, they are seen in Alzheimer's disease. As a matter of fact, in Alzheimer's, we think the tangles correlate better with the dementia than anything else. They're also present in a couple of other dementias, particularly the frontal temporal dementias, some of which have mutations in the tau gene. So tau has really become a bullseye for research in neurodegenerative disease, and this is perhaps the best example. It's trauma causing something wrong with the tau protein. It starts to aggregate in the cells, and then they start to die, and you get this dementia, which was initially called dementia pugilistica. And this was a boxer who retired at age 33. At age 50, had trouble with forgetfulness, mood swings, paranoia, occasional violence, confusion, becomes demented. Brain is very small. So this is, at this stage, you can see this because the brain is atrophied. Now, the bigger problem is that now there are stains for tau. So what this group did, Ann McKee's group at Boston University, is they started looking for this bad disease in young people who died but had a history of playing sports, or they were veterans. And what they found is they found areas, small areas, where you get the same tau deposition. Now, what we don't know is if you have this, are you going to get the really bad thing that the boxers had and die from dementia? We don't know that yet. This is brand new. The other thing is some of these people were pretty young. So this is not an NFL player. This is an 18-year-old, high school player. So how young can it happen? What kind of exposures do you need to get this? We don't know that. Those are the kind of things. This is a 21-year-old college football player. To make it more complicated, these people died, and unfortunately, many of them died from suicide. And when now the brains come to the people, examine the brain, they go talk to the parents. What they hear from the parents is, well, they committed suicide, he was depressed, he was violent, he was angry, he was emotional. What we don't know is whether this disease caused that, or whether that just caused the suicide, what got you the brain. So that's a big problem. We have a project now where we're trying to fund a project to go out and get brains from anybody who's died, and if they've had a history of head injury, bring them back and do this stain and see how big a problem is this, because we have no idea. There's only about 70 brains ever examined. Most of them are these really unusual cases. Most of them were NFL football players or boxers, but there are these cases that are very disturbing. And then there is the studies in football players. If you look at their cognition, and depending on how many concussions they had, you can see that the more concussions, the worse cognition. And there are some studies claiming increased dementia in NFL football players. Is this going to be something we're going to see in the veterans who come back after the blast exposures? We don't know, but we're worried. And we really need to do research to sort this out. There was a study from the Mayo Clinic. I don't know if anybody's ever been to the Mayo Clinic. Anybody been there? It's an amazing place. It's like Disneyland for medicine. But anyway, they have a captive population in the county. And they were able to go back and find the football players from 1948 to 1956. And they found 438. And they had controls who were in the glee club or the band. real controls, right? Not quite the same mentality as those, hunks. But anyway, they found they didn't really see much. There was an increased risk of dementia, but it really wasn't large, and it wasn't statistically significant. So it doesn't look like it's a huge effect, but we don't know if it's a small effect. So NIH is the major funding for biomedical research. The DoD actually funds more TBI research lately because they've gotten a lot of money because of the military issues. And this is kind of where our money goes. The biomarkers for risk factors like the MRI or blood tests of brain injury, diagnostic tests, mechanisms in animals, exploring what happens if you blast or hit an animal to the brain, how does the brain recover, what kind of treatments are there. We have a big trial going on now testing a neuroprotective therapy in acute, fairly severe head injury, 1,600 patients, should be done fairly soon. We have an intramural group. Steve Kaminsky's here. He started this. We kind of followed behind him. He made us think it was our idea, but really it was his. And this is an intramural group between Uniformed Services University and NIH, which studies traumatic brain injury. So we have clinical and animal studies going on. We have a partnership with the NFL to fund research in this area to get to the bottom of some of these questions that I brought to your attention. We built a large database for all the TBI research in the US, and the DoD helped us, funded a lot of this, and we basically put this together. So we're trying to get all the traumatic brain injury research into one database so people can really explore it and get the most of it. We have a project to understand what are the best treatments in people who've had moderate or severe or concussion, and that's international with the European Commission and the Canadians. This is just kind of launching. We just funded one looking at children with head injury, trying to get large numbers of children, understand what their outcomes are, what led to good outcomes versus bad outcomes. And with that, I'll end up with a cooling picture of NIH in the snow. So happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Teresa Rankin. I'm the originator of a national multimedia project called BrainLine.org, which is funded by the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center.
You have those videos on there.
I do. In fact, if you go to BrainLine.org, you can see the first documentary that was produced with a focus on the sports injury with Dr. Jim Kelly, who's now the medical director at the Intrepid Center.
Right.
But my question for you and the exciting developments that are happening is, where are you finding those leading edges of the research for new technology like that diffusion tensor imaging, and understanding how to develop the mechanisms to capture the information and translate it?
Right, so all those are problems that you have to attack one by one. And I think what we are lucky at NIH to be able to do is to attract, really smart people to work on these kind of problems. So the Connectome project is a good example where you had these really smart physicists. These are physicists now. They're not biologists. They're physicists who understand MR physics, water movement, and you kind of get them involved to build these new technologies. But it costs a lot of money. I don't remember how much, but I think it's the order of maybe $20–30 million. There's a project at Mass General, and there's a project at WashU, and then UCLA and Minnesota are involved, but it's the high end. And but their job is not just to make stuff that no one else can do. Their job is to make stuff and then, as you say, disseminate it into practice. So they're doing that too. But it's going to be an issue. Lots of issues to work out. Yeah.
I'm interested in the diagnostics that are used. Is it always MRIs? Is it certain type of magnetic resonance imaging equipment or what?
Right. So in terms of the diagnostics, I think that the most powerful techniques we have at the current time are actually the neuropsych tests, because they tell you, the neuropsychological tests. So they are validated tests. So it's like IQ tests. So you know what they can estimate what your quote-unquote pre-morbid IQ is. by lots of different things, what you know, where you went to school. They can make an estimate, and they can tell you if your IQ is lower than what it should be after a head injury. And that's pretty secure. And then over time, you can see if you're getting better or not. So that's valuable over time. So I think, and those are relevant to the person. You know it's real. Some of these MR pictures, I don't know if they're real. Like the soccer thing, some changes in the white matter, but these soccer players were fine. So maybe it's irrelevant. I don't know.
As far as the scanning type equipment that's being used, is it just?
Well, the scanning, the stuff that most doctors will have access to are the MRIs. There are a couple of other things. So some people do particular EEG analysis. They look at the brain waves, and they can show changes in brain waves related to concussion, especially if they've had a previous brain wave.
And is that used like immediately after?
So in the studies, they do them immediately after, right? And then they follow them over time to see how long it takes the EEG to get better. And the data from that is that the person feels normal before the EEG is normal. So it's a pretty sensitive test. There's another one called the MEG, magnetoencephalography. That has big advantages over EEG because it's looking at electromagnetic waves, which are transmitted right through the bone from the circuitry on the surface where those folds were. So the MEG gets you really good information on the circuitry activity.
You said that's called MEG?
Yeah, it's called magnetoencephalography, otherwise abbreviated as MEG, whereas the other one is electroencephalography, EEG. The electroencephalography, the electrical activity doesn't necessarily go straight out of the bone. It kind of gets moved, goes through the eyes, goes through the back of the head more. So it's not, you can't locate as well with EEG as you can with MEG. So though MR, MEG, EEG, those are the primary tests. But the one that's most relevant to a person, individual, is still the neuropsychological tests, we call them. Standardized tests, millions of people have had them, so you know exactly what they mean.
I was interested in the treatment, and you had mentioned there are some similarities between the brains of people who experience these TBIs and Alzheimer's, and talking about the tangles that's caused by the protein. Is there any research or anything we can learn from Alzheimer's as well as how to really to look at those proteins and those tangles to maybe reverse them?
So really good question. So if you were the head of a pharmaceutical company and you wanted to get really, really rich, you might study this disease to get to that question. But not because you want to cure this disease, because you want to cure Alzheimer's. So I think that this is a good example of a really clean situation where you can actually look at what caused these tangles to form, how do you stop them from happening. So the pharmaceutical companies are thinking about that, no one's kind of jumped in. But they are totally committed to trying to find drugs that block it in Alzheimer's disease. And it turns out, by everything we know so far, it's the same exact tangle. So if they do find something that works for Alzheimer's, it should work for this, and vice versa. The really interesting thing, which we learned yesterday at the meeting, is that there is now a compound which they've been linked, which binds to tau. And they've been able to link it with a very low radioactive tag, so that you can use it in people. And they showed pictures yesterday where in Alzheimer patients, it looks beautiful, like it's absolutely lighting up the tau. And so we think that within a short period of time, we will be able to see, if you have a lot of tau, we're going to be able to see it. And if we have a good drug, we can potentially see it leave the brain too. So we're really optimistic that might be helpful for both these disorders. But the money is in the Alzheimer's, because I mean that's really a big public health problem.
But it would be able to help people with TBI because
who have this chronic traumatic encephalopathy, right? Concussion people, we don't know if that's the case. Yeah, right here.
I'm Leslie Ritter, I'm a Society for Women's Health Research. Just interested in a lot of your examples were on football players, and we know the science has told us that men and women's brains are different and have different reactions. Have you noticed, or have these studies or the meeting yesterday brought up women, do they have the same kind of, obviously they have the same symptoms, but do they have the delayed recovery? there any differences in treatment?
The only thing I'd say is women tend to have more migraine, and migraine makes things a little worse. And then studies have been done, particularly some of the college studies have been done with women hockey players. So they are developing a number of women as well, but no one's yet published that I know of the gender differences. I don't think they have enough yet at this point in time. Because remember, they had 14,000, they had 570 concussions. So they would need a lot of women playing contact sports. Yes?
You mentioned circuits in the white matter, and I was just wondering, when they become damaged, do they ever return back to full function, or do they remain bruised? Is that what causes the dementia?
Yeah, so and that's another really good question. I was actually in an argument with somebody about this thing the other day, so probably nobody knows. Personally, I think they do recover. Some people say that they just die, and other ones that are not damaged take over the function. So that's where the fight is. But it seems, yeah, I mean, it could be either way. What you do see in traumatic brain injury is you see the brain shrink over time. So something is being lost forever, for sure. But whether or not, how much recovery versus how much replacement or takeover, I don't think anybody knows yet.
I'm Justin Smith. I'm a health policy fellow with Senator Biden. I'm also a medical doctor of radiologics. And my question is, it seems as though we're doing an enormous public policy, healthcare policy experiment with the kids who are exposed to football throughout the country. Some areas more important than others. Lacrosse, another sport that involves head injury, and soccer. And my question is, it seems as though, we don't know yet, I understand that, but it doesn't take much to speculate that when these kids are older, there's going to be a significant overall drop in IQ. There's going to be some fraction that will go on to dementing disorders who wouldn't have otherwise. And both of those have implications for their own happiness, their future, but also tremendous expense for the public. That, you know, it's in the category of, we spend a lot of time saying, please don't smoke, blood pressure, exercise, eat correctly, blah, blah, blah. And yet, it's, I know of high schools in the country, Texas, for example, where the thought of not playing football, you might, I mean, that is as close to being something out of the Bible. I mean, it's almost a verse that you'll play. And so I'm wondering what you think about just the public policy implications of such a large cohort being exposed to this.
Well, I think that's, I mean, the issue is we have half the knowledge. The question is which way you want to go. So parents have to make this decision every day. So I think our duty is to best explain the state of our knowledge to the parents, and then the parents have to help make a decision. Now, the idea of outlawing football is not a new idea. Actually, the president of Yale tried to outlaw football in the 1800s because he thought it was too violent a sport and it shouldn't be played. Boxing, the American Academy of Neurology, they worked for 20 years to outlaw boxing. It's not outlawed. So I think we have some real social issues that we have to make. Now, who's going to make those? Is it personal decisions, government decisions? The issue of the states passing a law that you have to have a player examined by a healthcare professional before the return to play had no provisions for the people in the low-income areas that don't have access to healthcare who need to play football, or the town that has, you know, their lacrosse team that I used to coach with little kids running around hitting their heads, who the guy who owns the field doesn't want to give them the field anymore because they're afraid of liability issues. So this is going to be a big problem. I think you hit the nail on the head. This is going to be a big problem, and you know, society has to figure out with the information we have, what do we do? We'd love to be able to figure out what we should be doing. I mean, a lot of the evidence says, you know, 99% of the people are normal at a week. And we can't see any difference. So there was a study, I probably should mention it, where they looked at the football players over the season, preseason, postseason, counted the concussions, they did the monitors, thousands of hits. They could not find any difference before and after in the group of patients. Now there were a couple that changed, but that could have been, could have been variants. But it's not a big signal, at least as far as we know now. In boxers, it's a bigger signal. NFL, biggest signal. But in the kids, we don't yet know. But I think we have to collect the data.
So shifting topics a little bit, I know there's a lot of research going on in inflammation and Parkinson's.
Inflammation.
And I was wondering if there is more evidence to suggest that inflammation is causing the stronger link to Parkinson's or the underlying damage, the initial injury.
Right. So I guess one thing I didn't mention is that the dementia pugilistica, they have Parkinson's-like symptoms. So the cells that are involved in Parkinson's are vulnerable to head injury, it seems. And the role of inflammation is high on the list. So there were recent reports that came out of Scotland where they had a brain bank, a bank of brains of people who've had head injury and lived for a number of years. And there are now new ways of looking at inflammation, and they're seeing inflammation goes on for years. So the meeting we had yesterday was called neurodegeneration due to traumatic brain injury. So that's the question that we were discussing, and inflammation is one of the possible causes. These brains, this chronic traumatic encephalopathy brains I showed you with the tau, they don't have a lot of inflammation though. So it's not entirely clear where it stands.
So along with the great mathematicians and physicists, who are the people who help develop like the biomarkers and where does that science come from? Innovation.
So the biomarkers, a lot of people are working on blood biomarkers, less, but potentially more money in spinal fluid biomarkers. So for instance, in Alzheimer's disease now, the spinal fluid reveals tau going up in people with Alzheimer's, and it's really predictive. So, and and it's been tested in boxers before and after boxing match, and the spinal fluid tau goes up after a boxing match, but also a lot of other injuries. And then it comes down again after a couple of days. So, and some people are now trying to find it in the blood. The Department of Defense, as you can imagine, you have a soldier, a blast, they like to do a quick blood test. Does he have it or not? So they've invested hundreds of millions of dollars into that. And there are some very interesting blood results that are coming out now to indicate that there's been some brain injury. But we're not sure how sensitive and specific they are yet. But for instance, in our study where we're testing this drug in traumatic brain injury, we were also funding them to take the blood and sending it to the company to validate their biomarkers. So a lot of action there too.
Walter, a question. So you presented a very nice story from the standpoint of assessment of the injury and possible treatment of it. But from the standpoint of the Congressional Biomedical Research Caucus, one of the things that they should be asking is, what about rehabilitation? And where should the rehabilitation research be taking place? And who could lead the forefront of that rehabilitation research?
So I think NINDS should do it, but I'm biased. But I think, when I was running an intensive care unit, I would have people come in with severe head injury and they're completely paralyzed, unconscious, comatose. They leave the ICU after a month and they're comatose and they have respirator and they can't move, they're just stiff as a board. And a year later they walk in and they're talking. So the natural recovery process that you see in traumatic brain injury is like nothing you could imagine. So understanding that process, I think, is critical. Now, as you also know, I worked in stroke, and there's a lot of emphasis in stroke and what happens to the brain after stroke. Very few people doing that in head injury. So I think we need to move people into that space to understand how the brain recovers, find out what the mechanisms is, and then tweak them to improve the mechanisms. Now, in terms of rehab, again, most of our research has been focused on stroke rehab. You have a weak arm, you can measure it, it's very clean. What can you do to make the arm better or let you to walk better? But I think we could do the same type of studies in traumatic brain injury, but they're a little more difficult because you don't have that. In the stroke, you have one area of brain, you know what it does, you know it's damaged, and you can watch it get better. Traumatic brain injury, it's all over the brain. It's hard to actually put your finger on what it is the important thing to measure. But I think we need to move into that much more heavily. Do you have any other thoughts?
Well, I actually think that that's one of the areas that there should be growing focus because it's not, I think it's going to affect so many different disorders, not only acquired disorders like traumatic brain injury, but also other inborn disorders. So I think that rehabilitation and acceleration of rehabilitation and sometimes habilitation is where there's going to be a rich opportunity to understand the neuroplasticity and how to accelerate repair.
Can I offer two resources? Many of you have asked questions to understand the advances in imaging. If you go to the website dcoe.health.mil/webinars, the Department of Defense offers for free incredible open webinars where you can hear from many of the researchers that you're talking about, the collaboration going on between NIH and the Department of Defense. And then the other resource about advances in rehabilitation is actually funded by the United States Department of Education, the National Institute on Disability Rehabilitation Research, NIDR. Their website is www.msktc.org, Model Systems Knowledge Translation Center. And it's actually based in partnership with George Mason University, which is where my friend Dr. Kathleen Lewandowski, the chair of the School of Social Work, she is a veteran from Operation Iraqi Freedom and worked in the forward operating bases. So she's taking her lessons and knowledge and putting into a whole new generation of empowering social workers to understand across that broad spectrum. And again, if you have time to check out the website brainline.org or even brainlinekids.org, talking about sports and women's injuries, a lot of the research that's coming up from university-based projects can be found there.
Hi, my name is Shauna Trona from Research in America. I'm more interested in learning how budget caps work at your research. Can you give us some picture of how that will affect your doing?
Well, I think, I get that question a lot. I think the answer is that science is going to move forward. How fast it moves depends on how much resource it has. So the less we have, the slower it's going to go. Yeah, well, I think, I'm embarrassed to say the NIH budget for traumatic brain injury research is $79 million a year. This is a huge problem, but no disease I know of gets what they need. So that's what we have to deal with. I think it's a social decision. Do you play sports? Where do you want to put your money? In research? You want to put it somewhere else? Roads? We got lots of things. But so I think we could do more if we had more resources. I don't think there's any question about that. The project that we have now with the NFL, huh?
I'm sorry, $79 million for NIH's budget for
Traumatic brain injury research. So the project the private part of the partnership we built with the NFL brings in $30 million, which is considerable given our annual budget. So I think we could do a lot more. And there's a lot, the thing about traumatic brain injury is, I hate to say this, but the interest in it before the war was much, much lower than it is now. So the money that the DoD has invested in traumatic brain injury research has just brought people into this area because they could get funding and do really cool science. And now we have all these people, and I think we can really make a lot of progress. I'm not sure in terms of DoD plans long term what that's going to be, though. I mean, their funding is upwards of $1 billion over the last 10 years for traumatic brain injury research. But before that, it was very low. So is it a blip? The problem is not going to go away. I mean, you can see from the helmets, the problem's been here a long time. It's not going to go away. The helmets may change, the problem's not going to change that much. But with more resources, I think we can do some really amazing stuff now. I want to thank everybody for coming. Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Thanks again for inviting me.